Hello everyone and welcome to Political Animals, the news and opinion segment of the Commoners podcast. My name is Adam. Now normally John and I would be recording separately, but today is kind of a special Political Animals. We've managed to work things out in which we are recording together. So John, hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited for this.
Yeah, this is rather an unusual one. So the structure of this will look a little bit different. We will each offer stories kind of in turn, and each one just kind of have a chat, have a little discussion about the things that have been going on this week in our respective locations. So John, would you like to start?
So this was a slightly underreported story in the US because everything else is going crazy. But this is insane. So I figured we'd ease into this, start a little slow this week with what's coming out of the U.S. So the Alabama Senate approved a bill which would allow Briarwood Presbyterian Church, they're a mega church in Birmingham, Alabama. They have over 4,000 congregants, and they actually have a Christian school on the premises. The Alabama Senate voted to pass a bill which would allow this church to basically form their own police force. And this is not just security details. This isn't private security. The police officers will need to be trained and certified by the state. And according to the bill, the officers would be given, quote, all the duties and invested with all the powers of law enforcement officers of the state of Alabama. The officers' power would be limited, however, to the church campus.
Okay. That kind of makes sense. I mean, aren't small police departments anyway just kind of institutions that look after, geographical areas and a certain number of people?
Right, but they're not employed by, they're employed by the state. So these officers are going to be employed by this church. Let me put it to you this way. To put this in perspective, okay, Alabama in 2014 amended their constitution to essentially put language in there that made Sharia law illegal. So the irony here is rich, where essentially if a mega mosque were to come to them and say, hey, we want to set up our own police force and institute law on our own premises, do you think that they would have been jumping at the chance to give them trained officers, trained to the standards of the law in the state, and then giving them the powers to execute the law of the state? Do you think that would ever have even gotten close to a vote?
No, but that's not what the question was. It's the question is more, can institutions have a designated police force, like institutions separate from the state or the town or whatever it is. So for example, the university that we went to might not have been as had its own particular police force, but they were still trained police officers with the authority of the law. They still carried weapons. They were still employed by our university. And especially considering that this church is literally the size of the town that I grew up in. A small rural town in southern New Hampshire. And it would not surprise me if, for instance, they had a bigger police department than my old hometown.
Probably. I don't know. I'm just uncomfortable with this. So, I don't have a problem, I guess, if there are police details that are given to it. But in the United States, I mean, essentially, most of the time, the attitude is that, hey, if you want extra security, you need to pay for it privately. And yet these security officers, they don't have the strength of the law, but they are trained in weapons and they have to be certified in certain ways and stuff like that. But that's a private entity. Like, you're essentially saying that these police officers they have the force of the law of the state, and they're specifically affiliated with this church. I'm uncomfortable with that. I don't know. I guess it's just the hard separation of church and state that I hold to. It's just a part of my political philosophy that I'm fairly inflexible on.
For me, it would come down to the details. So if for instance, that and it might not be hard necessarily in the state of Alabama, but if it was part of the job description that these police officers also had to be Christians, perhaps then I would have an issue with it, because there's no necessary function or role as part of being a police officer that requires you to be a Christian, even if serving on. I can understand if, for instance, the mega church wants to maintain a permanent police presence, which isn't possible through a municipal police department, and therefore want their own staff. But I guess for me to be okay with it, it would have to be in the details, and I don't know what those are.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't able to find details on whether or not there's taxpayer funding involved, or, for instance, if they were putting stipulations on it. But being Alabama, I would not be surprised.
Shifting gears now to Europe, where yet again the first story on my list has to do with some explosive device. 3 devices exploded on Tuesday next to the Borussia Dortmund football club bus, which was carrying players travelling to a match against Monaco at their home stadium. No one seems to have come forward to take responsibility. However, an Iraqi man is in custody and is suspected of setting off the explosive devices. Now, supposedly he was also a part of the so-called Islamic State, being part of a command unit based in Iraq in 2014. 3 letters were found at the scene, each claiming responsibility, which isn't really an ISIS calling card, especially considering that none of them contains symbols of the Islamic State organization. So between the Iraqi man and another 28-year-old, this time a German man who is also under suspicion, neither have yet been charged. But the Iraqi man is going to be detained in custody and has actually been issued an official arrest warrant, and will remain in custody as the German police try and figure out what happened. Unfortunately for Dortmund, they went on to lose their match 3-2. So,
Was anyone hurt or killed?
No, which is why we can be a little bit more kind of flippant with it. Fortunately, no one was killed. One of the football players for Dortmund did break his wrist, but he, I believe, went to the hospital, went home that night after getting a cast. So,
was he flopping? Sorry. I can't help but throw in a dig for football players.
Do not insult the beautiful game.
Well, I mean, the reason I asked if anybody was hurt or killed is because I wanted to make jokes at the expense of soccer players.
Now, unfortunately, the game was postponed only a day. In fact, the team were rather upset by the fact that their request to reschedule the match for a later date were essentially completely ignored. But essentially, getting back to the point, it kind of puts pressure again, or adds to the zeitgeist in Europe of a malevolent presence that's out to get you. Every week now, we've had something happen in Europe, from the British attack in Westminster, the St. Petersburg train bombings, the truck ploughing through a crowd in Stockholm and Sweden, and now you've got a bomb going off in Dortmund. It's adding to that overwhelming type of feeling that something is out to do you harm in Europe, and I don't think it's factoring in well to people's feeling of safety.
It'll be interesting to see what kind of effect that these attacks are going to have on the French election, which we are covering on Monday.
Yes, by the way, the reason why this Political Animals is being hosted as such, in which we're recording together, is because we just get done recording our French election special, so don't miss it on Monday. There you go, a little self plug. But yeah, you've not only got the French election coming up, you've also got the German election as well. And of course, the big theme this year is the nature of anti-Islam and the rise of the right wing. So yeah, you're right. We'll see how it factors in the coming weeks. Another story coming out of Europe this week, well, not so much Europe as another one of our neighbours down south in Turkey, is the Turkish referendum happening this Saturday. The Turkish referenda is about a few amendments that the current government, led by Recep Erdogan, has proposed, essentially giving himself a lot of extra power. Now, these amendments will go a long way to creating a strong executive branch and a weak legislative branch. The current system within Turkey is a rather weak, almost ceremonial, or at least supposedly ceremonial presidential position, and a rather strong legislative branch in the parliament, with a government that is held responsible by that parliament. What the new amendments seek to do is completely abolish the role of Prime Minister, essentially the head of that government, and establish the President as a combined President-Prime Minister, making the President both the head of state and the head of government. Essentially what this will do is allow President Erdogan to rule by decree. Erdogan was first elected in 2014 as the first democratically elected president, and essentially has been running the country for well over 10 years. Now, most of you will remember last summer's failed coup, and that was followed by a state of emergency. That state of emergency still exists, but what that means is that he can make any rule he wishes by decree. What these new amendments allow for is essentially the permanence of that rule by decree. It's the Turkish people being given the opportunity to democratically give up a democratic system. It's rather ironic, and I think we've sometimes talked about it in terms of, the American system, the British system, the idea of democratically giving up your democracy, but the Turks literally have that opportunity in front of them.
I'm gonna sort of geek out here for a second. I don't know if you're a fan of Star Wars, but it reminds me of when, essentially in episode 3, I think it is, when the Senate votes to give all these powers to Palpatine because the Jedi are going nuts, or he's saying that the Jedi are going nuts. And then there's that line that says, "This is how democracy dies, with thunderous applause," or whatever. So you're in times of trouble and, you're afraid, you're going to cede this power to this person. And Recep Erdogan is one of the last people in the world I'd want to have such centralized power. I mean, this is a guy who literally put pressure on the German government to say, I don't like the way that I'm being represented in your media sources, so punish that. He has a system where family members can basically cop on other family members that are saying bad things about him and things like that. His crackdown after the failed coup was insane. He was jailing academics and thousands of people in jail and being tortured and imprisoned. The guy's a maniac.
And there are also kind of allegations coming out that the folks that are opposed to this, the political campaigns behind opposition to this referendum, are being suppressed, so much so that some are being sent to jail. Certainly, it's the No campaign, so that the No campaign are being denied the ability to protest openly or to hold campaign rallies. It's just not a nice position for anyone that believes in a kind of progressive democracy. It's just not a good time for Turkey at the moment, especially considering that, given he's already ruled the country for more than 13 years now, since 2004 largely, because it's technically the institution of a new constitution, everything resets for him, so he would be allowed to rule Turkey up until 2029. So really, it's ensuring his support. Now, of course, there are a lot of kind of complex dynamics also working out here. So since the 1960s, Turkey has been plagued by political instability due to their parliamentary system, essentially handovers of governments, quite kind of a rapid succession. And then you've also got the secular versus religious dynamic as well happening in Turkey, but with Islam. So Erdogan kind of represents a conservative Islam wing of Turkish society, while the other half truly believes in secularism. They want a non-religious state. And so this is kind of a play by the religious conservatives, essentially, to step in and cement their authority through a single authoritarian leader in Erdogan.
Yeah, and the last thing that we need in that region of the world is one more authoritarian Islamic state.
Especially considering that this is also a NATO member. It is also a country that is in line to eventually join the EU, although this would be a major step back, as the EU will not allow an authoritarian regime to join it. But technically, it still has democratic elements. The president will still be elected. But then again, given how much the government has interfered with the campaign so far, who's to say that it won't interfere in general elections either?
Well, exactly. I mean, that's another thing I was thinking, is that knowing Erdogan, or at least reading a lot about him and following how he's ruled Turkey so far, I am not confident that those referendums are going to be on the up and up, if you know what I'm saying. I think that he's not above influencing the vote to, how convenient, the people democratically elected to turn me into a dictator.
Well, right. So, in fact, I had this thought earlier. It's interesting that at the moment you can easily have referenda within the Turkish system by an agreement between the president and parliament. But if these referenda pass, if this particular referendum passes, then Erdogan is in complete control over referenda, and he does not have to call another one.
Exactly.
On any situation, he can rule as an authoritarian dictator, essentially, literally decreeing law.
And like I said earlier, that's exactly the type of power I would not want someone like Erdogan to have.
That's right.
He's just too unstable. So I think the final story of the week that we're going to get to, and it's actually several stories, but I know that both Adam and I have a lot to say about this. President Trump, this happened like literally right after I finished recording last week for Political Animals, and we were left it on the note of we weren't sure what his response was going to be to the chemical attacks in Syria, and we kind of were going to get an idea of what sort of leader President Trump wanted to be in the world. Well, we found out about 10 minutes after I stopped recording. He ordered a missile strike against an Assad-controlled airstrip in Syria. He launched 59 Tomahawk missiles at the target, killing 6 people. You know, there are conflicting stories about how many of those missiles actually hit their targets. If you listen to the Russians, it was as few as 23. If you listen to the United States, it's as many as 58. But some planes actually were able to leave that airstrip the next day, I think it was, to carry out attacks on the rebels, so I'm pretty sure it wasn't too effective. Since those strikes, a U.S.-led coalition airstrike killed 18 allied Kurdish soldiers in Syria. It seems clear that the president does not have a defined direction or policy towards Syria at all, because he's striking, or his government at least is striking indiscriminately. So he'll strike Assad, and then he's botching airstrikes and killing 18 allied Kurdish forces, which we don't want to do. The Kurds are actually one of the very few forces that we might want to support in Syria. Originally, when he ordered the strike on Syria, I was freaking out because with all of the political background of Syria, with what's going on with Putin and the potential escalation with Russia in that case.
I was asleep when the Syrian missile strike happened, being 5 hours ahead of the US Eastern Seaboard. And so I woke up with it must have been a good number, let's put it that way, a
like
good number
8.
of messages from John. Rather stressed, rather anxious, so much so that I had to make sure that my family would see Christmas. But I get it. Like if especially at the outset, when you're talking about firing missiles into a Middle Eastern war zone in which the biggest, apart from yourself, obviously, the biggest nuclear power is also in the region, you do begin to question, all right, how bad has this been? How bad has it gone?
Well, interestingly too, we had talked about this. You and I, Adam, had talked earlier in the week. What was the significance of Steve Bannon being dismissed from the National Security Council?
Yeah, that's
and at
right.
the time, I didn't really think anything of it. It had happened shortly after the chemical attack in Syria, when it was being blamed on Assad. But I didn't put two and two together. I probably should have. Steve Bannon is the ultimate non-interventionist. He doesn't think that we should be involved in these wars at all. He's very much an American first, pro-nationalist sort of person. And he was probably the only voice on that council that really was saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't strike Syria. And his dismissal probably has something to do with this. I bet they're probably directly related, in that his influence in the National Security Council just isn't going to be there. And now it's essentially controlled by neocons who will be more than happy to escalate what's going on in Syria. And I've also mentioned before that Trump likes to follow, or is in my estimation easily influenced by his advisors. So it'll be fun to see how this plays out.
Don't you find it interesting, though, that the last 3 presidents have all run on anti-interventionist platforms? So Bush was an anti-interventionist. He did not want to intervene in conflicts abroad. Obama came in and say, no, we now need to get out of those conflicts that Bush has gotten us into, and yet went into Syria anyway. And now you've got Trump, who essentially ran on an anti-Obama platform, saying, no, we need to pull all of our guys back. And yet Trump has also begun to intervene in conflicts abroad. So I think the obvious thing is, one, it's not the man, it's not Trump. There is something in the intelligence he receives, or perhaps in the advice that these men get. Perhaps there are too many neocon advisors around the White House, from administration to administration. But nonetheless, there is something that must be quite clear to them that convinces them otherwise of the platform that they actually ran on.
Well, my cynical side would immediately point to the military-industrial complex that we have.
But at the same time, if I would still hope that your party platform wins out and that the military-industrial complex doesn't necessarily advise the president on that deep a level to convince him of something that he's held true for, a presidential campaign is 2 years. So if Trump has run a literal 2-year non-interventionist campaign and then 4 months into his presidency decides to strike Syria, then there's something there. There must be intelligence there somewhere.
Perhaps. I mean, we wouldn't ever be privy to that anyway, so maybe that's the case. But I guess the far-reaching effects of this are essentially what's going to keep me up at night, because up until this happened, up until the Assad gas strike, the gas strike that is being attributed to Assad, we can get into whether or not it was him. I'm not fully convinced that it was the Assad regime that did the gas strike. But up until then, all the news was how horrible Trump is doing. The media was very much adversarial against him. Also, part of that was the investigation into his connections to Russia and the Russian influence on the election. And he gets this golden opportunity laid in his lap to flex some muscle. And if we've learned anything, it's that the media really responds well to shows of force. You have the missile strike in Syria, and Trump's ego, I think, sort of probably was puffed up a bit by the response that he got. I think 85% of media outlets, at least in the United States, were covering it positively, viewing it as a show of force against ISIS, not against ISIS, but against Assad, and against the use of chemical weapons against his own people. And what I find dangerous about that is that Trump may or may not take that as a mandate to become a little bit more interventionist, a little bit more aggressive in his stances. For instance, President Trump directed a naval strike group to travel towards the waters of the North Korean peninsula. A show of muscle, this coming off the backs of the Prime Minister of Japan, essentially saying that he suspects that North Korea has the ability to send a missile with a warhead of sarin gas as far as the Japanese mainland. And actually, just before we started recording this episode, Trump dropped the MOAB, the mother of all bombs, the biggest non-nuclear bomb that we have in Afghanistan against a tunnel structure of ISIS. So I guess my concern is that the high that he's experiencing off of the response he's getting to his attacks in Syria could fuel a more robust, aggressive interventionism, because it's universally being covered positively.
When it comes to international interventionism, though, I do tend to be a realist, so I'm not a complete anti-interventionist. I think there are times in which the state does need to protect its own interest by interfering abroad somewhere. And I'm finding it difficult not to, provided that the intelligence is correct, I'll grant you that, provided that it indeed was the Assad regime that used the chemical weapons, I can't fault Trump in the decisions that he's made. I can't fault Trump in using the MOAB against ISIS in Afghanistan. Who can say that any action against ISIS is a bad thing? North Korea is flexing its nuclear muscles. Like, what is wrong with making sure that you have a defense force in place, especially for allies like South Korea and Japan that are so close to the United States, in terms of both philosophy and militarily. So I guess I'm a realist when it comes to international conflict, is that yes, there will be times in which intervention is necessary, and I can't fault anything that Trump has done yet. Out of those three things, like, I can see his reasoning. Again, provided the intelligence as we receive it as, plebs, is correct.
Yeah, well, so here's the thing. As far as the Syrian strikes, first of all, I'm not convinced that Assad was responsible. I think that launching missile attacks so early after the attack, the gas attack in Syria, I think that was maybe a little bit premature. I mean, there's still investigations going on into that right now as to where that was coming from, who used the chemical weapons and all that. And there are things that you could point to that maybe don't add up. So not to be a conspiracy theorist or anything like that, but I would be surprised if it was Assad, essentially, because you're basically saying that he is the stupidest person on the planet. Assad is winning in Syria right now. Like, essentially, he is beating back the rebels. They're in a very controlled area, and he's winning battles. He's taking back cities. Why would you then violate international law in such a massive way? Why would you use chemical weapons on your own citizens at this juncture? The only people that helps is his enemies, people who would like to see him taken down, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like the rebels. So al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, ISIS. The people that would most benefit from Assad going down, though they would benefit from a chemical strike, not Assad. He had nothing to gain from that. And so I'm not convinced. So I think that maybe there should have been more patience involved. I think that a direct escalation like that is irresponsible, especially in Syria where you have Russia essentially backs Assad. And so an escalation against Assad is a proxy war. And an escalation against Assad is an escalation against Russia, which I don't necessarily think is the best idea. So
certainly probably not the wisest.
No, and I more than anybody would like easing of relations with Russia. I mean, and finding ways to work with them rather than, have them escalate. And obviously he has his ambitions in Europe and in Turkey and Crimea. So we have to be careful with that, but it just rubs me the wrong way that we struck so quickly in Syria, I guess. And also, yeah, I mean, what's the delineation? So we suspect that he uses sarin gas, which is horrible. I'm not trying to make any excuses for how horrible it was, but we basically just sat by and did nothing while he was shelling the crap out of Aleppo and killing way more people than what this sarin gas attack killed. So, I mean, it's just, we'll send in conventional bombs because he used non-conventional bombs.
I guess that's kind of the point, though, is that chemical weapons are expressly illegal in international law, and perhaps it necessarily shouldn't fall to the Americans to enforce international law in that case, but the US did in that instance.
There's also questions of whether or not it was really legal for him to do, both internationally and even in the United States, because he didn't really get approval from Congress to do so.
He's the commander-in-chief of the military, though. Such is the nature of the US Constitution.
I guess I'll just never get used to the idea that Trump is the commander-in-chief of the military. Oh, God. Yeah, so, I mean, I guess that's my problem with his actions in Syria. North Korea, I guess you could probably make a case for what he's doing. I just think that Kim Jong-un is tapped, for lack of a better word, and I'm not certain that just having our strikers out there is going to keep him from doing anything crazy.
But that's kind of the point, is if he does do something crazy, then, the defense force is there. And I cannot see the removal of the North Korean regime as being a bad thing either. And especially as China begins to perhaps cool on being such an ally of North Korea, perhaps an opportunity is coming up soon in which you can finally get rid of the North Korean regime. That, of course, has been the dream of American presidents going back many, many administrations, but we're still with it. So, but it does need to end at some point. You know what I find very, very funny is, and I'm almost hopeful for this, is that Trump ends up being the most successful American president. Could you imagine Trump being at the center of the end of the Syrian civil war in which peace is established, or Trump being at the helm of the American military as it walks into Pyongyang to liberate it? I mean, if it was to happen during his...
This is like freaking 1984 there, buddy. Like,
but at the same time, like, if he plays his steps right, sometimes history is just on your side. Like, there is an extent to which the North Koreans can continue to exist under such a regime. There is an end. There will be an end to the Syrian civil war. But wouldn't it just be funny if everything kind of finished up neatly with a bow under the Trump administration. Technically could happen.
It could happen. Well, I'm more convinced that it would happen in North Korea than it would in Syria, because if you topple Assad, that becomes a hot mess. And I mean, we haven't been able to solve Iraq. We had toppled the authoritarian strongman in Iraq, and we're still dealing with it. We're still in Afghanistan. It's like, and we'll get to Afghanistan in a second, but it doesn't work out toppling governments in the Middle East. It just doesn't, especially when you have these fractured elements of Islamic terrorism.
Well, I think the American government is very good at dismantling and not very good at reconstruction. So it's, but I think it's learning. So where it failed in Afghanistan and Iraq, it might succeed again under the wisdom of Trump in Syria. You never know. It's.
Yeah, well, I guess to me, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, which is kind of what we're doing here.
In a sense, though, it is different administrations doing the same thing, so it's not technically the same person. Perhaps there is a national insanity, but, it was Bush in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was Obama in Libya and Syria, and it's Trump in Syria again, and perhaps North Korea.
I guess my thing, though, is that they were all listening to the same philosophically aligned
kind of that neocon.
Advisors. So there was the same philosophy behind what Bush did and what Obama continued to do and what Trump is going to do now, is that the United States has a central role in whatever is going on in the Middle East. We do view ourselves as the world policeman, and unjustly, I think. I don't think that we should be entrusted with that sort of power, because we've been not great with it.
Although, who do you have otherwise? Russia? China?
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Germany hardly has a navy.
That's true. But I mean, what has? Okay, I guess there would be a totally different discussion to see what American show of power has functionally done to limit wars in the world. So has it actually been a deterrent? I mean, it hasn't deterred terrorists at all. I mean, honestly, I guess maybe that's where it stops, because or the influence of the United States meets its logical endpoint, is that flexing power on a state level is way different than with these fringe groups and terrorist groups. Is that states have a citizenry and a government to protect these. ISIS, while it does have municipalities and stuff that it does, essentially, they're okay with dying for their cause. They're okay with that. They want us to come attack them because they believe that it will eventually usher in their new caliphate. So we're fighting a completely different ideology. If we were flexing this sort of muscle with France, France is going to fall in line because their national interest is to do so. But how do you take traditional geopolitics and apply it to people whose philosophy is so outside of the realm of what has worked in the past?
I guess just as I'm thinking through kind of my knowledge of world history, the only times in which states have been able to fight ideology is by either annihilating it or accepting it. So I'm thinking revolutionary France, the beginning of Marxist Russia, Leninist Russia. These were big ideologies that were threats to the state, and suddenly they became the state.
Right. But I mean, again, how do you annihilate it? I mean, our attempts to annihilate it in Iraq have only created more. Every bomb we drop creates more radicalization. So I mean, the problem is that it's a problem that a heavy-handed approach probably isn't going to solve, but that's probably all we're going to get with Trump. That's what we've seen so far. So, for instance, in Afghanistan, with the bomb that he just dropped today, the MOAB, literally the largest non-nuclear bomb ever created. One of the biggest problems with the Afghanistan invasion with Iraq was the what we would call the collateral damage, which is essentially dead civilians. You're dropping a massive payload on this area, and it's you're wiping it out. But what is there no way to do a more surgical strike? It just seems like such a heavy-handed, ham-fisted response. Again, my first thought was, oh shit, Trump launched 59 missiles into Syria. He got a great response. Now he's flexing muscle with North Korea, which a lot of people probably see as a good thing. And now he's dropping the biggest bomb we have except for our nuclear weapons. Like, that escalated really freaking quickly. Like, I guess the realist part of me thinks, okay, yeah, it's ISIS. Like, he's trying to flex his muscle, but how effective is a flex of muscle going to be, first of all, against terrorists? And second of all, are we going to lose, I guess we probably already have, but are we going to lose essentially sort of what makes us have the moral high ground? By just indiscriminately killing, I mean, that MOAB did not just kill ISIS. Like, it has a blast radius of a mile.
That's speculative, I guess. It's not, I don't know what the outcome of that particular explosion was. But then again, like, this kind of goes back to the realist part of international affairs for me, is that, you know, the States has never been a principled nation in its history when it comes to international intervention. You look at the dealings that it had in Latin America, for instance, ousting democratically elected leaders and in their place installing despots simply because they weren't communists. Like, there's no principle there. There's only national interest. Or again, kind of in, you know, the fight against communism, in which the United States, along with the UK, propped up the Mujahideen, which eventually became the Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. So there never really has been principle. It's only been interest, and I think that is just the nature of international interventionism. Is that for the sake of national security and national interest, your principles kind of go by the wayside. I don't like it.
Yeah.
And I think it is, and I will hold both the UK and the US to account for doing it, but I recognise it as a realistic element of it, which kind of sucks.
I mean, I'm fully aware of the realistic element of it. Like, I understand that, you know, the position of always maintaining the moral high ground is idealistic. However, drop the veneer. Don't tell me that you're the world policeman and that you have the best interests of the world at heart. Don't sit out there and tell me that you were heartbroken about Assad dropping these chemical weapons and that was the red line and, you know, we have to strike. It's like, you didn't strike Israel when they were dropping white phosphorus shells on civilians in Gaza, right? We propped up dictators who committed genocides. And we never stepped in and did anything because it was interest, obviously, over principle. So fine. If you're going to do that, don't blow smoke up my nose and tell me that you're doing it because it's the best thing for the world. It's not. It's the best thing for you. Right? So I guess that's my issue. Like, yes, there is realism, but this sanctimonious bullcrap about how we are the moral authority in the world police, that's never been about. So just drop it.
Well, that's it. Thank you for joining us for this rather special Political Animals, John. It has been a pleasure just really discussing the news with you. But nonetheless, we had to come to an end. So please, if you enjoyed what you heard, please follow us on Twitter at CommonersPod. We also upload all of our episodes on YouTube. You can subscribe to us there. Don't forget to catch the Commoners podcast itself on Monday. It will be dropping into your feed, and this time it is the French election special, so don't miss it. It's going to be quite an interesting one. John, it's been a pleasure. We will see you soon in the next episode. Until then, stay informed.